Hello, everybody, and welcome to this ICP Webinar Series. It's so good to be with you all today, wherever you're coming from in the world. If it's good morning, if it's good afternoon, or good night, thank you so much for being here. My name is Brad Keller from Keller Education, and we're collaborating with ICP on this event. And what a privilege it is for both us and to collaborate with ICP and to bring our global community together for this session, the first of two. We got another session tomorrow, which is also going to be really, really engaging. So thank you for being here, and it's wonderful to have you all online. Of course, we had really great success with our event on AI at the end of 2024, and after tackling that, the community said, "Wow, we really need input on equity, and as a leader of a school, a leader of an organization, we need some ideas on how to deal with this." Because it's this elephant in the room. We talk about it, but we don't know what to do about it. And hopefully you can find some answers today. So folks, I'd love to kick off today's session by hearing a little bit from you. There's going to be a poll that's going to go up now. I'd love the opportunity for you to just read it. It's 4 or 5 questions, multiple choice. Click at which one means the most to you, and we'll share those results straight afterwards. I'll be back in about a minute's time.
As the sun goes down, it's another day lost for now. And no wonder where you woke up this morning, cause it's just last night, but all your kisses, it's just a touch, but all your lips. And she was beautiful, and we put our hands up to the sky, screamed the lyrics loud, not shy. Then you put your hand in mine, and oh well, they fell perfectly together. She looks like Pocahontas, but she wears these high-top sneakers with a button up. She's so indie, but she's really beautiful. She's beautiful. And she grabbed me closer, and so I said, well, hypothetically, theoretically, and well, she said nothing, and well, she kissed me instead as the sun starts to rise and the twilight nights. Then she kissed me for her last time, and she was golden, golden as the daylight comes, and I'll probably never see her again. Golden as the daylight comes, and I'll probably never see her again. Golden as the daylight comes, and I'll probably never see her again. Golden as the daylight comes in. Well, they're falling in love and they won't pretend. And it's just a thing, but that is the thing, cause I don't know if I want you to hear this song. Would you sing along, would you turn it off or turn it up? Would you learn the lyrics and come see me the next morning? Because I don't know what I want or what you want. But the thing is, she looks like Pocahontas, but she wears these high-top sneakers with a button up. She's so indie, but she's really beautiful. She's beautiful. She grabbed me closer, and so I said, well, hypothetically, theoretically, and well, she said nothing, then but she kissed me instead as the sun starts to rise and the twilight night is thin. She kissed me for her last.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that. We went on a bit longer because a lot of people are coming in a couple of minutes late. And so we just wanted to give them an opportunity to complete it too. But don't worry if you missed out. It's not the end of the world. And don't worry if you're watching this recording later on. We're going to share those with you now. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Bianca, who's backstage here in our studio in Cape Town. And she's going to share a bit of the results, which will also be shared on your screen. Bianca, what can you tell us about what the community are feeling about these different questions?
So Brad, if we look at question 1, we asked our attendees, in your current school or region, what is the biggest challenge in achieving equity in education? And the majority answered that it's limited funding and resource allocation.
Oh, fantastic. So funding, resource allocation, a worldwide problem, whether you're in the West or the East, if you're in Africa, doesn't matter where you are. This is definitely a worldwide problem. And I believe this will be picked up in one or two of the panels during the session. So that's great. Let's go over to the next question.
Yeah, also interesting. We asked our attendees, what is the most critical area where teacher training should focus to improve equitable learning outcomes? And about 50% online today suggested that it should be strategies for inclusive classrooms.
Fantastic, fantastic. So actually getting into the classroom, even though ICP is a worldwide leadership organization, tailoring that down to the classroom, what is actually required to happen in the classroom? It requires the leader to develop that strategy, and that's definitely going to be picked up today. What's the next one?
So beyond academic access, what aspect of equity in education needs urgent attention? Now, this is amazing because we had 100% of people online today answering that it should be mental health and well-being support.
Wow, mental health, well-being support, particularly for leaders. And we're seeing around the world the amount of leaders that are burning out because we are not looking after ourselves and we're not prioritizing our health. And perhaps that needs to be a topic that we dive into in the very near future in another webinar. Let's go to the next one.
All right, so question 4, we asked, in resource-constrained settings, what is the most effective way to expand access to quality education? So this one, we kind of had a split 3 ways. Some people felt that it's public-private partnerships for infrastructure support. Others were in favor of teacher professional development through technology. And we also had people online today who thought community-led education initiatives.
Wow. Very varied and all very relevant. A tough question to answer. And I think based on your own sort of perspective and your own context is which route you would choose. But hopefully that will also be picked up during the session today. And I think we've got one more question.
Yes, so our final question was, which strategy would have the biggest impact on promoting gender equity in education? Again, quite varied answers. Things that came up were engaging communities to challenge cultural barriers, strengthening mentorship and leadership programs for girls, and creating gender-sensitive teacher training programs.
Wow, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for all your insights today. And that's just to kick it off and get you involved. And I want you to keep that interaction and involvement going. So if you have a question, if you have a thought, if you had a comment, remember the smartest person in the room is the room. So we want to get your comments on that chat box so we can get the engagement going. So let's look at what today's session is going to look like. So right now you had me do a very brief little introduction with you. I'm then going to be handing over to Peter Kent and Lee Elliott Major in a moment for a bit of an interview, a bit of a discussion. And then we're going to go on to presentation 2, where they will be joined by 2 more incredible leaders in their fields. And then we'll wrap it up with our Executive Secretary, Sophia Hughes, interviewing Mitch Weathers and Paul Ellis. And that is also a session that you're absolutely going to love. And we will wrap up on the button in about 80 minutes time from now. So folks, I want to thank you for being here. I want to now tell you a little bit more about the 2 speakers that are going to start off. So the first speaker that you're going to see now, that's going to be just really introducing the speaker, telling you a little bit more and asking a couple of questions, is Dr. Peter Kent. You know him very well, an ICP past president, an ex-head teacher and leader for many years himself, and for lack of a better term, a bit of a legend of ICP. And it's so great to have him online with us today. He'll also be in the chat box throughout the day. So link with him. I'm sure he would love to stay connected. Joining him is, for some of you, a new face, very well known in the UK and in fact around the world. But Lee Elliott Major, I've had the opportunity over the last couple of weeks to connect with him, an incredible man, a wealth of knowledge, professor of social mobility at the University of Exeter, and Britain's first in this field. And what's more interesting is that equity and inclusion is more than just a job and profession to him, but it's really personal. And you'll hear in his talk, in his presentation, tell you how this links to his background and how he's lived through this journey. So folks, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Peter and Lee now, and I hope you enjoy that session.
Hello. All of us who've been part of ICP for some time will know how important the theme of equity has been to the organisation and its work. it's great that we've got the opportunity to focus now on that theme of equity through talking a little bit to my friend and colleague Lee Elliott Major, OBE, who is the first Professor of Social Mobility in the country at Exeter University. I'm delighted that Lee has agreed to come and talk to us today about his work in this field. And Lee, what I wanted to ask you on behalf of all of us who are members of ICP around the world is, how does your work on social mobility relate to this theme that matters so much to us of equity?
So thanks, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. My work is dedicated to improving the prospects for those from more disadvantaged, or what I would call under-resourced backgrounds, those young people and children who are facing extra barriers to their learning. And I know that, you know, most teachers, I'd say all teachers, go into the profession with equity really as part of their mindset, you know, to improve life prospects for all children, irrespective of their background. So my life passion and profession is really about that very topic. So it's a real privilege to share some of these thoughts and work with you. I'm presenting on this around the UK, indeed around the world, which really is a real privilege to have so much interest in this from the profession. So I'm going to share with you in the next 15 minutes some of the ideas around what I call the equity approach, and then some of the sort of practical ideas from these sort of principles that I talk about for education. I'm going to start off with my own story because it really raises some of the issues that I want to address. And then I'm going to talk a bit about some of the divides we face across the world. I call them the sort of opportunity divides, the sort of inequities that we face. And then I'm going to talk about some of the practical things that I've seen in the classroom at school level to address some of these issues. So my story is a very simple one. It's one that's echoed across the world in many ways. I come from a background where my mother and father didn't go to college or university. I lived on my own at age 15. So from a background that would be classed as disadvantaged in many ways. And I am famous in the UK for being known as the bin man turned professor. And this is a newspaper headline from a few years ago on that. The pictures to the left, by the way, are pictures of me when I was growing up as a teenager in the 1980s. And you can see I had all sorts of looks, sort of dramatic looks when I was younger, which always gets a bit of a laugh from the young trainee teachers that I lecture to when I share those pictures. But the reason I share this newspaper story is because I think it highlights some of the tensions in this debate around addressing inequities in education. And while I am very proud to have been a bin man, I was a bin man for a summer, by the way. I was a student at the time. My mum worked for the local authority, the local state council here in London. But the thing about this headline that I worry about is that we belittle those people who are bin men, right? And you know, I would argue that it's equally valuable to do something like being a bin man as it is being a professor. And as Peter said, I am the first professor of social mobility in the UK, we think in the world, in fact, which is an amazing thing. So one of the things that I try and do with my work is challenge what I call the deficit mindset, which is to think of some people in society, those that do particular jobs, as inferior to those that do other jobs. And I think as educators, we just need to be really careful to value people who come from different backgrounds, whether they are poor or wealthy, what other characteristics they may have, that we are different. We're not being judgmental around that. So one of the things I'll come back to again, as it really is part of the equity approach, is addressing, challenging what I call the sort of deficit mindset, which plagues many of the education systems that I look at. The other thing about this story is that I happen to be quite academic, and a teacher took me under her wings when I dropped out of school, and but the thing about my life that I wonder is if I'd been more creative, arty, or sporty, or vocational, practical, would I have fitted into the education system in the UK as I did? And another theme of the equity approach is to value all human talents, not just academic grades, important as they are, but other aspects of human talent, whether it is generosity or practical skills or other skills. So another problem I find with many education systems around the world is they have a very narrow view of human talent. And then finally, this story, the other point I always make about this is that I was a product of collective endeavor. It was a teacher who helped me. It was my best friend's parents who took me in their home when I needed a place to live, to stay. It was an uncle, my mum's brother, who's long passed, who gave me some money to go to university. So another worry I have with some of the debates we have in public policy and in education is the emphasize individual achievement. And actually, my view is that we underplay, well, we don't talk enough about the collective endeavor and the fact that we are all products of other people. So this is really embracing, I call, the equity approach in education, and I'm going to explain some of the principles behind this, and it really hopefully resonates with my own story. This is who I am. I'm a professor of practice, so I've done other things. I've been a chief exec of a charity before becoming a professor. So I've tried to do things as well as look into the research and do teaching. So this is really about trying to make something happening in the world. This is a metaphor I use a lot in my work because I do think that we live in a very unequal world. So this is the sort of unequal playing field. And I call some of this, fixing what I call the rigged race of education, because it's so one-sided to those that tend to come from more wealthy, more privileged backgrounds. So I use that metaphor a lot. We'll come back to that. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to go through this quite quickly. I will share these slides with everyone who's interested in more detail. I want to talk a bit about the societal divides that we face as educationists, as education systems, then some of the principles of equity, and then some practical ideas. And as I said, I'll share some of these slides afterwards because there's lots of detail in some of those ideas. So the thing that we observe in social mobility studies, so social mobility really measures the origins of people, where we come from, who our mothers and fathers, who our carers were, where we were brought up, and then when we end up in life. And the idea is that the more mobile a society, the less the link between where you're from and where you go to. And that's a kind of measure of equality of opportunity. So the more mobile a society is, the more we have equality of opportunity. The thing is that all the studies I've done across the world on this show sadly that we're very far from that world of equality of opportunity. And here's just one graph, is actually from the United States, but you see this mirrored in other countries as well. And what we're finding is that in previous generations, that young people in America and other countries were doing slightly better than their parents were on average. But the world has become more unequal as the generations have moved on. And we're seeing for the first time, and this graph shows this, that those born in the 1980s on average are doing less well than their parents. And you see this in terms of average earnings, ability to get a house, all these sort of measures of life. And one of my worries is that the young people and children that we are all educating are facing these real big issues in wider society. So what we're finding is that there is a group of people across the globe, probably around 10-15%, depending on how you define it, who are incredibly detached and wealthy, the elites, if you like, of the world. and they're able to survive and flourish because of their wealth. But there is an increasing number of us who are just finding it hard to live, right? So this is really part of the societal divides that we are observing across the world. And it's important because often politicians will give education the sole responsibility for addressing these divides. So one of my messages actually to best politicians is, yes, we can up our game in education, but you're going to have to address some of these inequalities outside the school gates, as well as us trying to improve what we do within the classroom. So that's a really important point, and many politicians forget this in some of these sort of public debates we have about improving, if you like, the life chances of everyone. This is just a graph from the OECD summarizing a number of countries, and I just wanted to share this because it shows that in many ways, some of the progress that we've seen in recent decades has stalled in more recent times. So this is just looking at the chances of going to college or university if your mum and dad left school with few qualifications. A bit like, again, my own story. And you'll see about 15% of people from those backgrounds on average go on to go into higher education. So these are from quite low education backgrounds. But the problem is with this is that we had progress over those decades, those in the 70s and 80s, but we're now seeing this stalling. We're not seeing improved progress on that particular measure. And so these are just some of the challenges. Again, we don't have time to go into them in real detail, but I would argue that many people in the world are struggling to live what I'd call decent lives. That's being able to pay the rent, being able to get the food on the table. That's something that's happening across the world, sadly. I think there also is an issue with a lot of parents and grandparents who've had bad experiences of schools, and now we're having, if you like, generational issues with schooling, and we're seeing big absenteeism rates across the world in many different systems. So these are just some of the challenges that we are facing. So the equity approach is based on my book, and this is the book. It's done with Emily Bryant, who's a teacher. We use England, the UK, as a kind of example of some of the inequities that I'm talking about. I'm actually at the moment thinking about how I could write this for a more global audience, but it's there on Amazon, and some of these principles are universal, but it really looks at the UK as a sort of case study. So equity is about doing more for children who are facing these extra barriers to learning. And this is symbolized here by this picture, by that fence being higher. That's the sort of symbolizing these extra barriers. And what that pile of sort of books is trying to symbolize is us doing more for those children who need it the most. So it's not really about equality, it's about doing more. And I've been inspired by some of the race equity literature from around the world. I'm interested in social class, socioeconomic background, as well as those other characteristics, because that is one of the biggest predictors. How poor you are, how your socioeconomic background has a profound sort of influence on your likelihood of doing well in the education system. So equity is really about equity is about doing more for those children. That lower picture there is really about working with children, family, not doing it to them. I'll come back to that because that comes back to that idea of challenging deficit thinking. This is a paragraph from the book around deficit thinking, and I won't read this out for time here, but as I said, happy to share these slides. But really, it's about trying to put away some of the judgments, some of the unconscious biases that we have about people from different backgrounds, and reflecting on our own cultures and our own assumptions and biases that we create sometimes unintentionally, unconsciously. And it's about meeting people and parents halfway and finding out what they bring. So as I said, I'm interested in social class, socioeconomic background. it's shown in every single study that we've done across the world that it's such a powerful predictor of education outcomes. It intersects with lots of other characteristics. And one of the books I'm doing at the moment is looking actually at how the interplay manifests itself in different countries. So whether you're looking at India or China or Africa or America or Europe, how does this play out? So there are some universal trends, but then there are some nuances around the world about how socioeconomic background intersects with other characteristics. A key point of all this is that children face cultural as well as material barriers. And so a lot of my studies look at the sort of hierarchies, the way that we rank people in all our cultures. And it's really important this because some of the cultural hierarchies, it might be, for example, the way people speak, their accents, the way they look, their attitudes. There's the evidence suggests that again we have some unconscious biases where we might make some assumptions about people just because of the way they come across. Okay, so this is really important for educators because when you're in a classroom, you want to engage with all your children, but the evidence suggests there are some children who come with what I call sort of self-advocacy. Some people here have called it concerted cultivation. This is being confident enough to ask the teacher questions to advocate for yourself. So again, we've got to be careful with our assumptions about this, about working with all children, whatever their cultural or material background. So again, this is that metaphor I use of the unlevel playing field. I think there's a really interesting debate I have with educators about all this is to what extent are we encouraging children to play the game, to be able to advocate for themselves in a very, what we'd call in Britain, a very middle class way, to have those sharp elbows, we would say, to advocate for yourself, or do we try and change the rules of the game so that we actually allow people that might be a bit more collaborative to do better? So there's this kind of tension in some of these debates around, are we allowing the game to stay the same, or are we trying to change the rules? So equity practice. So these are some of the things that I'm discussing with teachers, educators around the world increasingly, and some of the sort of practical ramifications of these ideas. So one thing I talk about, and again, there are parallels with some of the race equity debates on this, is language. The language we use transmits our values. It really has a powerful impact on those that we are interacting with. So in the book, we change some of the terminology we use in these debates. So for example, we don't use the term disadvantaged children. We feel that that immediately labels those children and blames them implicitly, unconsciously for being disadvantaged, when it's actually the systematic inequalities, the poverty that they have faced that is the issue. So we use terms like children who have experienced disadvantage or children from under-resourced backgrounds. So one of the things I've been doing with schools is thinking about how do you speak? What is the language you use, and how are you consistent with that? I often see in many of the schools I visit that they talk about hard to reach parents. I think in many ways we're the ones hard to reach. So a lot of this language is about, again, confronting some of that sort of deficit approach that I was talking about. Another research topic that I'm fascinated with is actually the strengths, the assets that children from poorer backgrounds or those that have experienced poverty have. So things like resilience or being more collaborative or quick thinking. I think we could do better in actually acknowledging and celebrating some of these other attributes in the classroom. So another research field that I've been interested in is this area of teacher bias or teacher discrimination, some people call it. This is something that teachers don't do largely on purpose, and it's part of being a human being that we all have unconscious biases. But it's really important to know that in the classroom that teachers on average are less likely to interact with pupils who are less like them. And you see this this in terms of social class or poverty background, as well as other characteristics. So another exercise I do with teachers is to reflect on our unconscious biases and to ensure that we are engaging with all children in the classroom. This happens in every classroom around the world, I can tell you, as someone who goes in and observes the practice. There are a number of things that we use we use as proxies for children, for talent, if you like, and you just got to be aware that we use some of these shortcuts, if you like, to judge people. We fall into these judgments. So I'm a summer-born child in England. So in England, the term starts the school term starts in September. So if you're summer-born, if you're born in August, you are the youngest in your class. And what happens is teachers confuse that with ability. So people who are born in the summer in England tend to be put into lower sets for achievement. But there's all sorts of other attributes that we need to be aware of, including, as I said, accents that are seen as low status within a country or a region. Often we see that in the research that children who are high achievers are still underrated by teachers if their parents don't have degrees. So there's all these things that we kind of fall for as educators that we just need to be aware of. Another theme, as I said earlier, in the equity approach is to really think about human talent in a broader, more holistic way. So academic skills and basic literacy and numeracy, of course, hugely important. But what we're finding in the research is that things like arts and sports and other activities are just as important in developing the well-being and the general life skills of children. And part of this is also thinking about how we think about culture in our curricula, in the curriculum. And it's really important not just to have what we call high culture in the UK. That's the sort of traditional theatre and traditional forms of culture, but also to have contemporary Indigenous and local culture in your curricula as well. And I've spoken a lot about this in the UK and other countries, acknowledging people that have made contributions to society from different backgrounds. And then finally, parent partnerships. This is something that a lot of schools are grappling with at the moment. And there's some amazing ideas out there around trying to bridge this gap that has widened with many families and between schools and the families. And so there's some really interesting ideas about creating neutral spaces so that the parents who might themselves had a bad experience of schooling can feel comfortable in, and really trying to focus on non-academic things. It's actually about building up relationships. And there's a whole thing I do around how can we flip the power balance of the teacher-parent meeting so that parents can speak about their children. So some really interesting ideas about breaking down, I guess, some of that power imbalance between the schools and those families. So finally, just a few things that we're doing at the moment that have had a lot of attracted a lot of interest from school leaders in the UK and further afield in other countries. We developed an equity scorecard, which is really a checklist for schools, looking at a number of these areas that I've covered, but making this a sort of practical guide. And that's something that we're developing for different countries and for different types of schools. I'm also involved as a university professor in getting undergraduate students to act as school tutors with proper training. I call this the win-win-win model because many of these undergraduates get credits for their degrees, but they go on to do teaching as a career, which we need more teachers, and the pupils themselves have improved their literacy and numeracy. So I just wanted to mention that as well, because I think there's a real opportunity there with some of those ideas. And then finally, I just wanted to, leave you with some sort of ideas around this, and I call it the equity mindset. More than anything else I've said really today, it really is about changing the way we think about education and equity. And I think these are sort of some of the phrases I use a lot. When we think about people from different backgrounds, it's different to, not better than. I think when we think about how we work with pupils and parents, it's done with, not to. and we are more than just academic grades. So those are some of the terms that I just wanted to leave you with. And then a final warning. In my literature on social mobility and all the research we've done, which has been about 100 years now, this topic has been looked at, there are predictions that if we don't level that unequal playing field, then society itself will unravel. So I just wanted to leave you with this warning, if you like, from one of the top researchers in the field. This was actually written in the 1950s, a long time ago, but they predicted we would unravel if we don't address some of these inequities in about 10 years' time. So thank you very much. I hope that was very provocative, hopefully it's stimulating, and look forward to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Lee. Thank you to Peter for asking the questions, and what fascinating insights. A big thank you to you, Lee, for all that and sharing those slides with us too. Really found that fascinating. And I think what jumped out to me at the end was one of your closing lines when you said, different to, not better than. And that really, hits home with me as something that is really fascinating, that we need to be, playing in our schools all the time. And I did also want to just mention now, if you could, after that was a lot to take in, head over to the chat box now and maybe jot down just one thought or one idea that jumped out to you from that initial session. And while you go there, I'm going to introduce our next set of speakers. So after Peter and Lee have now had that conversation and started the process, we're going to get them to be joined by two more incredible leaders. And the first is going to be that of Leanne Otene. And many of you would know Leanne from the New Zealand Principals Federation. She's a shining light in education in New Zealand and in fact globally. Recently joined the ICP executive, and an incredible person, an incredible leader with an amazing story and incredible skill set in this specific field. She's a principal and of course also going to be hosting the World Convention in 2026 in New Zealand. So there's many reasons why Leanne is an important person to get to know, and you're going to thoroughly enjoy her insights today. And then the other great speaker is Welcome McClunga. Now, for any of you that have been at conventions, if you've been to many ICP events, Welcome's often there, and he is the most incredible man. A person who's dedicated his life to education, both in Eswatini and globally. Also recently this year has joined the ICP executive, which is also very exciting. Current president of ACP and a past president of the Eswatini Principals Association. So an amazing man with an incredible story and ability to draw people in with his storytelling ability and his view on leadership. So excited to sort of hand over to, once again, to Peter, to Lee, and Welcome and Leanne, who will be taking you through the next stage of this presentation. Let's hear from them.
Welcome, everybody. We're now continuing our discussion of equity by focusing upon some of the leadership challenges involved in equity. We went to the ICP community and asked them for the questions they would like to put to our panel who we've convened to explore these issues. And it was fascinating that so many of the questions came in focused upon the leadership challenges. If you are a leader in school, how do you promote equity and what should you do? And I've got three great people with me who really can take us through some of these leadership challenges. And the first colleague I'd like to go to, Leanne, if it's okay, it will come first to you. A good friend and colleague, Leanne team from the New Zealand Principals Federation. We're just saying before we started this recording how excited the ICP community is to be coming to New Zealand next year for ICP's convention in 2026. Leanne, you've spoken with such passion and force about equity and about some of the challenges involved in promoting it. Can I come to you first and ask for your perspective on this?
Yes, look, Peter, equity leadership is essential because education in New Zealand, like most countries across the world, really struggle to provide an equal playing field for their young people. While some children thrive with the resources and support available to them, many especially those in disadvantaged communities or come from disadvantaged communities, they don't have access to the same opportunities, I guess. So principals themselves, a key leadership challenge is advocating for those equitable resource distribution, resources, whether that is human resources or whether that is, from government to support with putting in programs in schools. So, and this is within schools and this is across the system. So that resource, taking into account equity, doesn't necessarily equate to every child getting what they need.
Yeah. Yes, I can well imagine that that's a significant challenge to try to look after the needs of every child. Would you have any particular advice you'd want to give to leaders who are looking to promote equity in their particular context, in their particular institution?
Well, look, in New Zealand, our principals are really committed to equity because we have an Indigenous population, and unfortunately, they are a disproportionate number of students who are in that disadvantaged group. So our principals here are committed to equity and acknowledge the importance of culture, language, and history. And we've really put in a lot of work over the last few years. We have professional development delivered through a program called the Māori Achievement Collaborative, or MAC as we call it. And so they support principals with leading that equity discussion within their schools. They understand in order for it to change, principals must be leading this. So it's about changing the hearts and minds of principals so that when they are leading the equity discussions within their schools, it's got that real emphasis. So some of the things that they really talk about is, preparing teachers to be able to be culturally responsive, making sure that teachers know where their young people come from, their backgrounds, and understanding their family dynamics, if you like. We call it whānau here in New Zealand. So having a true understanding that culture counts. And when we talk about culture, we also talk about language counts. So using their language in the classroom so the child can see that education is actually their language and culture is valued and is part of the classroom program. Connecting with those families, that's another thing that is discussed in the MAC program, is the importance of partnership with their family, involving them in the education of their child. We call it a true partnership. Another aspect is around making sure that teachers are thinking about setting high expectations of these young people. We often think that our young people, because they come from the low socioeconomic groups, or that they don't have what it takes to succeed academically. And in New Zealand, we don't have a lack of talent among our underprivileged children, but rather a lack of equal access to opportunities.
A very profound point. And I just thought at this point I bring in another voice that's very well known to the ICP community, our friend Welcome Malanga from the Eswatini Principals Association, and also current president of the African Confederation of Principals. And Welcome, I'd just like to ask you how what you've heard from Leanne resonates with you in the context and the community that you work in.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for having me. It's an exciting webinar, and I'm happy to be part of it and to actually bring the African context in the whole debate. One will start by pointing out that equity, in my view, acknowledges that our students do not start from the same plane. They come from different backgrounds, and that we need to appreciate, both as teachers and those that are in the policy-making sphere. And looking at our context, Peter, I would say much has been done by our policymakers in terms of putting in place policies that address issues of equity, which in my view also touches upon issues of inclusion, having every child from whatever background coming to school and getting the best from the education that is offered. So I can applaud our governments for ensuring that access is prioritized. And to some extent, much has been done to promote equity, to promote inclusion in our schools. And it is now rare to find children just staying home, especially at the primary school level. So we have policies and statutes that promote access to education, like what we call free primary education. In some countries, we have free secondary education, which means in terms of access to education, our governments have done well. But coming back to equity, much still needs to be done. Because when you have these many children coming to school, you find that we have overcrowded classrooms. And here it's children that come from different backgrounds and they have different needs. So the teacher has got to give each child the attention they deserve, the attention they need. But it becomes difficult, Peter, in our context, to do that when we have this overcrowded class. The teacher fails to focus on every child as an individual. So the equity element then is in a way not addressed, because equity, as I understand it, has to do with uplifting the one that is disadvantaged to the level of the other, so that they can all benefit in the education offerings. So I think in that aspect, Peter, we still need to do a lot, both at government level or policy making and at the school level, in terms of our own policies, school-based policies, and in terms of the practice. In terms of the practice. And when I talk about practice, I'm talking about what we do at the school level, our attitudes towards the children that come from different circumstances. How do we treat them? Be it issues of color, be it issues of race, be it issues of socio-economic background. How do we treat the different groups when they're at school? Those that come from less advantaged backgrounds, are they given more to place them at the same level with the others, or we treat them equally? These are the questions that we need to answer at the school level, as much as it is important that these issues be discussed and addressed at the policy level. One of the shortcomings that one can raise, Peter, is that our teachers or educators here are not capacitated to address the equity challenge in our schools. This goes back to pre-service training. Not much has been done to develop or prepare our educators to be ready for emerging issues in education, if I were to put it that way. Because the issue of equity to me is an emerging issue, or the issue of inclusive education is an emergent issue. So we need to understand it before we come to be teachers. The same applies with our school leaders. There is likely capacity building for them to be able to understand the issues of equity, issues of inclusion, and other issues that need our attention at the present time. So I can make a call, Peter, to say it is very important for those in the policy making sphere to make sure that schools are supported with the resources they need to be able to do whatever they need to do at the school level to assist the students that come from these disadvantaged settings. And also, when we share the resources, I want to submit that it is important that we look at the issue of, in our context, the rural-urban divide. It's important that the resources are not shared equally, because that tends to be the issue. That when resources, be it financial or teaching and learning materials, are distributed to schools, that is done equally. Schools in urban areas will get their share maybe based on their enrollment. The same will apply with the schools in rural areas. But the truth is, those that are in the urban setting have more advantages than those in the rural areas. So the call would be that let the resources be shared equitably so that those that are disadvantaged, if I were to say, get more benefit, and they can, to some extent, compete with the schools in the more wealthier or better settings. Maybe that is what I can say for now, Peter. Thank you.
That is good. And really interesting hearing both what Leanne and Welcome have said, you know, that there's a whole set of overlaps, whether it comes to supporting leaders, programs to help them promote equity, fair use of resources, issues around race, issues around socioeconomic factors, issues around teachers, all of which were picked up by the ICP community in some of the questions they sent in, and all of which, Lee, seemed to resonate with what you shared with us at the start of this webinar. It's great, Lee, that you're able to join our discussion, Professor Lee Elliott Major, and we're really grateful to you for your input and your expertise. How does what you've heard from Leanne and Welcome fit in with your work and your research in this area?
Well, it's wonderful to be part of this discussion, and what Leanne and Welcome were both saying honestly resonates, connects with so much of my thinking in this area, and it makes me realize that these issues are universal, actually, across the world, whatever classroom we are talking about. And we face across the world some really big challenges in terms of what I would call inequities, and that is driven by those divides in wider society that we see. And that can be, you know, in a New Zealand context, can be in an African context, can be in a European context. I think there are similar challenges. There are differences, but there are definitely some universal inequities that we face in our schools. And there's a number of things, I think, for leaders that you need to think about. One is, and it was so lovely listening to both leaders embrace. I could tell that they believe in this, right? And really, one part of leadership is creating what I call an equity mindset, which is just believing that every child can, if you like, fulfill, you know, their potential, whatever background they may happen to come from. The research suggests, you know, that we do have an unlevel playing field outside the school gates. So in my view, we have to do more for those children facing extra cultural and material barriers to their learning. And so the leader really sets the whole tone for this. I totally agree with Welcome. I think that the battle over equity, if I can call it that, is often in the classroom. It's often in the schools themselves. So governments will speak a lot about this, but in my view, unless the leaders themselves are really leading on this and asking questions about equity in regards to everything, then I don't think you're going to bridge these divides that we see. So it's really about a mindset, and we talk about this in our book, Equity in Education. And this is thinking about doing things with our communities, not to them. It's about seeing people as different, not better than, right? And we should be rejoicing different cultures and acknowledging people who bring different things to schools. What we find is that often and inadvertently, many educators fall into what I call a sort of deficit mindset, which is, we somehow have got to change you into our system. And actually, what we find in the research is that many of us, believe it or not, we're all human beings, okay? So we all suffer from unconscious biases. So I think, a really important part of leadership is challenging colleagues to think about, what do we assume? Our brains make quick judgments. We're hardwired to make quick judgments. So really reflecting on, are we genuinely interacting with all those pupils in the class? Are we genuinely acknowledging and celebrating the different cultures and communities that we serve? So training, I think, is absolutely critical on this. If I was in charge in some way across the world, I would have some sort of equity training, equity modules for all teachers and indeed professors as well. It's that important, because if we don't do it as educators, those inequities will widen. So no, it was amazing hearing both, and it really resonated with my own thinking. I like to talk about equity and excellence, relationships and results. So these aren't false dichotomies, right? These are, so here in Britain, sometimes, you might get pushback about, if you're focusing too much equity, do you compromise on your sort of standards? I couldn't disagree more. The only way that you improve results for all your children is if you focus on equity. Focus on equity and you will get excellence, is my view. So really lovely hearing both speak on this. I could speak for a lot more on these, but those are some initial thoughts.
Now, that's really helpful comments, Lee. And if I could just come back to Leanne, would you agree that there seems to be a great deal of overlap across the world, as Lee's just pointed out, in some of these challenges that we're facing? How do you think leaders are best responding to these challenges of equity that we've described in this discussion?
Yeah, just listening to Lee, it just resonated. That's what we're trying to do here in New Zealand, is really put that whole equity discussion, debate right in front of every single educator across the country. And we absolutely recognise that principals have to be leading this in their schools. Look, the challenge is not only recognising the barriers, but also implementing the strategies and giving our leaders tools and the professional development in order to address those inequities. So, that is important for us here in New Zealand, and that's why the professional development for principals is key. And having those discussions, the unconscious bias that you talked about, Lee, that's a word we're very, very au fait with here in New Zealand. Deficit theorising, we all know what that means now. We know what it looks like. It's really important for us too, that partnership with our communities, with our parents, with our families, with our young people, giving them a voice, making sure they know that their culture matters, that their language matters through the curriculum, that we set those high expectations, we have high standards, and we expect the very best. But what I really agreed with Welcome was this real need for policies and governments to support what's happening in schools. There is a need for those resources to be able to be not equally shared, but equitably shared, depending on the needs of the students and the young people in your school. And I really love what Lee said about it's about giving more. It's not about, you know, you like both of all of us have said, it's not an even playing field out there. Our young people are coming into those classrooms, and it's really important, the relationship between the classroom teacher and that child. That's where it starts. That's where the whole equity challenge starts, with the teacher and the child. That relationship, finding out about that young person, finding out what they need and what they what's going to make them thrive. How are they going to thrive in education? And then being able to put the supports and the resources in place. And quite often, and you know, I've just come from the other side of the world, and resourcing tends to be the issue we all struggle with, not enough learning support. And many of our young disadvantaged students have learning needs. And if you don't have the supports for them, because your government doesn't recognise or isn't able to provide, because it's not just about there are countries where they just don't have enough funding, or it's tough in schools to be able to provide the support that the kids need, like extra teacher support or specialist learning support, whatever it might be. If you aren't able to give them that, then you're always going to be pushing that barrel uphill. So, I mean, it's a positive mindset, as Lee said. In New Zealand, it's about changing the hearts and minds.
Thank you so much, Leanne, and welcome. If we could come to you, one of the things Leanne has just said that really hit home to me was she talked about resources not being equally shared but equitably shared. Does that sort of resonate with you, fit in with your experience in the African context?
Much, Peter, and thank you to Leanne for her thoughts. Yes, it does resonate, Peter, with us here. As I said earlier, probably we may not have done it to that scale in our part of the world, that is to focus on equity as a principle that must be put in practice in our schools. But I must acknowledge that the divide of private and public schools will show that the private schools tend to give the children individual attention. That is where we see equity, because children from different backgrounds, they are given the attention. But in the public schools, it then comes down to the issue of the distribution of resources. Because when schools depend on governments for their livelihood, then it becomes a challenge, because government resources do not come at the right time, I would say. Like, you will expect resources to be in the schools at the beginning of the year, but resources may come 3 or 4 months later. And the school is expected to address these challenges of equity and other challenges, like we are talking about quality education, because you can't talk about equity and leave out quality. You can't talk about access and leave out quality. These should work together. When we address equity challenges at school level, we need the resources. And if it's a public school, the resources will come from the public purse. And if the resources delay to come, then it is negatively affecting the school's capacity to deliver on equity. We may know about it, but that's one thing. But practicing it is another thing. But apart from the resources, Peter, we cannot hide behind resources. But in terms of advocacy, in terms of having every student, every teacher understand, as Leanne said, understand the value of equity, that alone plays a major role. So I believe, as school leaders in Africa, as elsewhere, we need to be at the forefront, as Professor Lee has just said. it's the mindset. So that doesn't need money. It needs us and our commitment to the principle, to have the principle being practiced in our school. But some of these changes may have to be in the physical space where we are. If we are talking about equity, we will need certain resources that require money, and that money has to come from government. But I can challenge school leaders to say, even in such context, we don't have to wait for the government to provide, because we have a concept of public-private partnerships. School leaders that believe in equity should challenge the business community to come in and assist the school addressing issues like equity, so that the children that come from the disadvantaged circumstances benefit from what the school is able to source from these private partners. So I think, Peter, the issue of collaboration and stakeholder engagement will come in handy in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you, welcome. And again, I thought very powerful comment you made that resonated with me when you talked about, yeah, money matters, resources matter, but it's also about us and what we do. Lee, this has been a fantastic discussion, and apart from all the really perceptive and wise advice that my two colleagues have given, just the passion with which they've both spoken about the theme of equity has really come through to me. I just wondered whether there was any sort of final comments you wanted to make to draw our discussion together.
So every school in the world is under-resourced, in my view, and that's because we give schools so much responsibilities to essentially level that playing field that we've been talking about outside the school gates. You know, that's a challenge for every school and school leader. But I totally agree. Again, sorry to agree so much, but you know, I think we're all passionate about this subject, and I think mindset belief can be such a hugely powerful thing, even in a context where you don't have all the resources you'd like to have. So we produced a number of practical tips for leaders and indeed teachers. And some of this, you know, is about language, for example. So in Britain, you know, we have had this term disadvantaged pupil. I won't use that term because it sort of implicitly blames the disadvantage on that pupil. As soon as you use that term, I use people from under-resourced background or people from disadvantaged community, maybe. So just your language, I think, will make a big difference. And as a leader, that is real leadership for me. So, you know, I won't talk about hard to reach families. I think we're hard to reach. All the language we use transmits our values, okay? And so I think language is just one practical thing. I think really, I know this sounds so basic, but the relationships we have with our local communities, what we're finding in our research is that schools are becoming the anchors, the centers of their communities in all parts of the world, actually. And a lot of that, and I go to schools around the world, and I can tell you, you get a sense of the culture, the relationships as soon as you walk into that school. And listen, resources are so important. I wish teachers were paid much more than they are across the world. No doubt about that. I will shout about that to, you know, all my life. But I do think that relationship, that respectful mutual relationships with all your communities and children that you're serving is so crucial, and that doesn't cost any money.
Colleagues, thank you so much. What an inspirational discussion.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much to the entire team there for getting that together. What an incredible session together, getting so many different insights from around the world. And I certainly believe that from those initial questions and that poll we had at the start of the session, many of those were answered. So thank you so much for your time, for everyone that formed part of that panel. Folks, once again, please head over to the chat box. Feel free to just jot down something that jumped out to you or a question or anything. We've got people, our team in the chat box that would love to connect with you regarding that. So now, while you're doing that, we sort of shift our attention to our final part of today, which is another panel discussion, interview, and a debate. And it's going to be chaired by someone you all know very well, the brilliant Sophia Hughes, our ICP Executive Secretary. Not only is she our ICP Executive Secretary, but a past school leader, a mastermind coach, incredible mentor, and of course, her day job is her school's development manager for Cambridge University Press. And so an incredible leader in the space and also a fantastic moderator and a dear friend. So wonderful to have her online today. She's going to be joined by an incredible man named Mitch Weathers. Now, Mitch, first and foremost, he'll tell you he's a teacher. He's also an incredible author of a book called My Executive Functions. And he'll tell you a little bit more about that, and he'll also share some links on that in the chat. He's founder of an organization called Organized Binder, which really works with schools and educators to find ways of developing the executive functions in the classroom. And it's a really fantastic space that he is in. And I know Mitch, when he's not doing all this, he's also a keen trail runner. So I can very much identify with that. He's going to be joined by Paul Ellis. Paul Ellis has spent years in leading positions in educational management. Cambridge University Press and Assessment. He's the thought leader there. He's also authored and co-authored over a dozen books in neurodiversity and inclusivity. So Paul comes with so much knowledge and experience, and I can't wait for these sort of three minds to join for this fantastic session. So I'm going to hand over to Sophia now, who will probably give a bit more of an introduction, maybe a better one than I could, and then we'll take it from there. I'll see you at the end.
So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. In this segment of the ICP webinar focusing on equity, we're looking at equity at the school and the classroom level. And we have invited two guests that are powerful voices in education and inspiring thought leaders that I have followed for several years already, and they've been advocating for the adoption of inclusive practices in schools for years. Their ideas resonate with the strong emphasis that ICP places on fostering fairness, respecting human dignity, and developing inclusive educational practices that transcend cultural, racial, and socioeconomic boundaries. So today we have Paul Ellis for Cambridge University Press and Assessment and Mitch Weathers from Organized Binder, from two opposite sides of the globe, practically, England and California. And we are welcoming them today to tell us a little bit more about themselves and how a focus on school and classroom level practices can contribute to the thinking about equity. So Paul, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sophia. Thanks for the welcome. Delighted to be with you here today. My background is as a teacher. I taught in schools and universities in the UK and France for quite a while. Then I came behind the scenes, first of all to work for the IB, and then to work for Cambridge University Press and Assessment, as we're now called, in the international section. I've had the pleasure of working all over the world with teachers and school leaders. And one thing which I was particularly noticing in recent years was the need to help people gain more access to education in all sorts of ways. So as you explained, it could be for socioeconomic reasons, could be for diversity reasons. But what I've tended to focus on more recently is the more kind of psychosocial reasons. So looking at neurodevelopmental issues and looking at various conditions, which might include those that we put under the umbrella of special educational needs in certain parts of the world. But it's more broadly as well looking at what is neurodiversity, celebrating neurodiversity, understanding that we all have a place to play in the world, much as biodiversity is really gaining ground in terms of sustainability and environmental development as well. So I match up the two, and I try to say to people, let's give as many people access as possible, but also to let them not only have access to education, let them participate and, very importantly, make progress.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself to get us started?
Yeah, Sophia, thanks for bringing us together. Paul, I'm super happy and honored to be here with you and chatting. As you mentioned, I'm based in Northern California. I spent most of my career as a classroom teacher, a ninth grade science teacher specifically. And early on in my practice, just realized that there's something missing, in my opinion, in the classroom and in my graduate program. And I didn't know what it was at first, but it became clear, like, oh, you, for my students, like so many of you are entirely capable, but you don't know how to do school, was kind of how I first started thinking about it. And in my pursuit of figuring that out, it became really clear that these executive functioning skills that really set students up for success and develop that kind of sense of agency and dexterity in their learning. We're kind of just hoping you pick them up as we move through this K-12 experience, or just through life. And I decided that we can't afford to make that mistake any longer, and had no intention of ever sharing my work. I just wanted to help my students be successful, and started working on a portfolio system that helped students, one, get organized, but then have practice with like actually doing these executive functioning skills within the context of the grade level or subject area that they're find themselves in. And then other teachers started showing up to my classroom and saying, hey, what's going on with this binder? I'm hearing all about it from the kids, because they're really feeling successful in your class. And fast forward, many years later, and I have the privilege, myself and my team, work with schools around the country and internationally to help equip students with executive functioning skills. So that's really kind of the core of my work. The program's called Organized Binder, and I wrote a book about that work, and it came out this last year. So it's been fun.
So how important, I think, as you're both mentioning, this idea of how do we open up the pathways for students to be able to feel successful, as Mitch, you were mentioning. But also, Paul, you were mentioning several terms, and in our initial conversation, we were trying to frame this conversation. We were talking about how there are so many terms that relate to inclusion, to neurodiversity, to special education needs. And so how do you, differentiation even, way back. So which are the terms that you think today are key or central to understanding what needs to change in the classroom, in the schools?
Well, should we begin with that word neurodiversity? I mentioned already that we make a comparison here with biodiversity. In fact, I was listening to something just yesterday, a really interesting podcast on this with somebody who's quite famous here in the United Kingdom, in being autistic. He's actually a naturalist as well, so somebody who's very interested in the environment. And he was explaining how, and I've heard this from elsewhere as well, that surely there must be a reason for diversity to exist in the way that humans are. So, for example, there are autistic people because we need autistic traits in the world. There are dyslexic people because we need dyslexic traits in the world. And so it goes on. The thing, though, is that there are what we might refer to as dominant neurotypes in the world, those that sometimes are called neurotypical, although I would shy away a bit from that term because I think that that's not really fair on those who might be considered untypical or indeed divergent. So you have neurotypical, neurodivergent, you have neurotypes. To me, then, let's focus on the neurotype aspect here, that in certain contexts, in certain cultures, at certain points in history, perhaps as well, certain types of people may dominate for various reasons. And I think each and every one of us may find that we have strengths and perhaps challenges in certain situations and circumstances as well. So I, for example, I'm somebody who loves speaking to people. I'm quite happy to speak in a conversation like this, but put me into a situation which is loud, in a situation with people that I don't know very well, and I might struggle. But I'm still the same person. But this perhaps is me demonstrating that in certain contexts, I am more introverted. In certain contexts, I'm more extroverted. Or when it comes to speaking or writing, I can do both, but sometimes I might feel more able to speak in front of an audience. At other times, I might actually prefer to be saying what I want to describe in a written form. So these are all examples of how each and every one of us at different points, from young children all the way through to adults, and I'd include in this people of an older age as well. My mother, who's 81, she really struggles in certain ways. I'm seeing it increasingly. I think all throughout our lives, there's certain situations which are harder or easier for us. And therefore, I'm really interested in what Mitch has done with the organized binder, particularly executive functioning, because I think if from an early age we're taught how to organize ourselves, we get the skills rather than, as this chap in the podcast said yesterday, the skills rather than the pills to be able to do better, then perhaps that's going to help us all generally in society to rub along better with each other and also have unconditional positive regard on each other to try to do the best for each other as much as we possibly can in all circumstances, and be aware that sometimes we have strengths and sometimes challenges and those around us the same.
Mitch, what about you? Do the same terms resonate, or are there others that have been more important in your trajectory?
I think there's and Paul could list them far better than I could. I think there's a laundry list. And what I find interesting, and I appreciate that, Paul, your explanation of neurodiversity, and we do have to be careful with these terms, but when we talk about being inclusive, just the language we use, like the three of us, we're very familiar with a lot of these terms and whatnot, but the very language we use can be exclusive to having inclusive conversations around education. So I love that description, Paul, and I like to think of neurodiversity as we're all neurodiverse. It's actually the norm. It's not an individual or a certain disorder or thing. And for my work, even the term executive functioning, it can sound there's definitions that sound very academic and unclear, to be honest. You're like, what do I do with that? And I'm a teacher. I want to help my students develop these skills. So the definition
which ones? Yes,
exactly. And then because executive functioning, if I was to define that, it's really an umbrella term, and there's different, if you will, kind of domains or verticals under that umbrella. And for my work, I like to keep it very specific to this teaching learning paradigm dynamic, and that could be a traditional classroom or not. Which skills specifically, not only one, set students up for success, and by the way, executive functioning is not an academic phrase or term, or these skills are not academic in nature. Paul mentioned it in his response, like these are the skills that set students up for success, or people in life and school as well. But which of those six, and then the other thing that's really interesting, are which of those skills, and then how do they influence other parts of that umbrella, which I think is a really interesting conversation that we probably don't have time for today. But for a definition, the one I like to come to, it's not my phrase or my term, but a school that we worked with reached out and said, we really want to help our students develop a sense of studentness. And they deliberately left that kind of vague. I was like, tell me about that. And we're like, well, we're so content driven and focused, and testing, we're so heavy on testing, and even technology. And not to say any of those are bad, but we want to develop the learner as a whole, the whole person. And what are those factors and aspects? And for me, I think that's a really nice and succinct definition of executive functioning when it comes to that teaching and learning paradigm in the classroom, or whatever learning environment it might be.
I love that word. I think it's such a nice one. I think it's a very relatable word as well. And there's kind of something almost homely about it. It makes people think, yeah, indeed, what does it take to be a student? Because there's almost an assumption. Those of us on this call perhaps may have found it relatively straightforward to go through our own education. Don't know. But a lot of decisions about education are made by those who have found it easy to get through education. We haven't necessarily had to learn how to be a student. So we need to be cognizant as well of the fact that there are lots of people who simply don't know. It's not in their being to be able to study in the standardized way that we're being asked to do. So to help people through that, particularly from a young age again, is going to be so helpful in so many ways throughout schooling and beyond as well. And I think it's remiss of us as educators not to give those skills alongside the knowledge.
Right. And it's when we talk about inclusion, there's a very isolating feeling and experience for students who are sitting in that classroom. And this is, I think, Paulo Freire really explained it well, that you can experience your education as a passive object, or an active subject. And if you're that passive object, it's kind of like it's happening all around you, but I don't know how to jump in. That's why I like to use that term dexterity, because I like to think of a young person in the classroom that's like, I have some agency in this. I know how to jump in, you know, and that was my experience. I made it through, but even to this day, I'm a genetically poor speller. You were talking about where am I happy and where am I not. Hand me the mic, I'll talk all day long. Ask me to read in front of a group, forget about it. You know, I like start sweating, and so I didn't know. I didn't have that sense of agency either. And so there was an empathy when I got into the classroom. It was like, oh, I know what you're feeling. And you may be demonstrating certain behaviors as a result of that, but it really comes back to you don't feel included and you don't know how to jump in, and you're looking around and others seem to know how. Where did they learn that? Because nobody taught me. And that's where you and boil it down to these sets of skills and habits that we, like you said, Paul, they need to be addressed concurrently in classrooms, right? Because we still have content and curriculum we need to teach.
Yeah, absolutely. And add to that as well, it really helps people with their well-being, because a lot of students, as you're kind of alluding to
Right.
there, get very stressed and anxious about not being able to study. They see the world going around them. They don't feel like they can participate in it. It then adds to their anxiety when they're trying to do, say, an examination or a test or something. So we need to think about that well-being. Well-being is about how you feel and how you function. If we can address the functioning part, which goes back to indeed executive functioning skills, being organized in a good way, then you're already halfway there, basically. You're going to feel better about education. You're going to feel more able and open and ready to learn as well. That makes such a difference. So again, job kind of half done in a way, if you can get kids in the right sort of position to be able to learn once more from an early age.
I was thinking of our community that comes from all corners of the world, the ICP community from Africa, the Americas, Asia and Oceania, and Europe. How does this conversation transcend those geographical borders or different cultures? That are kids the same everywhere? Are teachers the same everywhere? Can we think this way in different parts of the world? So what is your experience with some more international context and these ideas? That's a tough question. Who would like to?
You're the moderator. Who gets to go?
Go. We can take it. We can change the order.
Mitch first. Go, Mitch.
Okay. You know, I think that's I mean, I'm so honored to be here, not just because I'm with the two of you, but also just this community and recognizing that, you know, more often than not, learners are more similar than they are different in the classroom. Like there's some commonalities. And what I've found really interesting, if there's any silver lining when it comes to education, any silver lining to the pandemic, is it seems to me that there's like a global shift to, yes, we do need to develop the learner. It's not just about the content and curriculum that we're teaching. That there's this other piece, which I would argue all boils down to these executive functioning skills, but that when you look at what happened during the pandemic, there was this global experience for the first time in my life, and probably most people's, where all of a sudden I'm found myself speaking with educators in the continent and context and culture and language, even grade level, K-12, elementary, college. The conversation was very much the same, that something happened during that pause, and executive dysfunction was not uncommon to find in classrooms, both for teachers and students. So when you talk about inclusive work that translates through culture, geographic location, of course, there's different contexts when we look at the stuff we're teaching, but when we look at developing young people as learners with agency, my experience is that is absolutely transferable and translatable to any context.
Perhaps, Paul, I'll ask you to take this same question for the sake of time and maybe think of what advice would you give school leaders who from around the world who are thinking about going this direction?
Oh, well, first of all, I'd agree with what Mitch was saying. I find kids pretty much the same wherever you go around the world. They have the same needs, the same urge to want to do something in their lives. They want to know how to learn, know how to do things. They want to work out their own values. They want to understand each other. They want to work with each other. In fact, that latter point is a particularly big thing again that I've seen since the pandemic is people want to collaborate. They really want to get on with each other. There's a lot more collaborative edge to younger people perhaps than of maybe an older generation. Maybe I'm just seeing this. I have no actual kind of academic reference to evidence to say that, but it's just what I'm seeing. I see kids much more accepting of each other and of each other's viewpoints as well. And perhaps this leads us into this diversity aspect there is that kids in classes these days may be more open to seeing what else is possible as a learner. They're ready to learn from each other as well. So if we talk in terms of, say, metacognition or self-regulative ways of working, they want to know how another child in the class is doing the same task. I often use an example in mathematics where, say, very simply, you want to multiply, let's say, 18 by 5. I can think of at least 5 or 6 different ways of doing that. When I was at school, I was taught one particular way because that's the way the teachers taught it back then. If it would have been taught a different way, perhaps I would find it much easier now. And similarly, other students would find it easier if they knew there's more than one way of doing something. So that's just an example from mathematics. There might be examples from other kinds of subject areas as well. So what can school leaders do? Well, school leaders need to open up the possibilities, really. Enable their staff to learn a lot more about these kind of areas, to understand inclusive education, neurodiversity, aspects around metacognition, self-regulation, executive functioning skills, all of these different areas. So good professional development is a good starting point. One thing I would say, however, is that there are certain countries in the world that may not be in a position to be able to talk about diversity in the ways that some other parts of the world may be able to do. And I'm absolutely not going to name any names of any places here. Those listening in will know what this is about. And there's a survey that came out just last week from a bunch of international schools where they were looking at, for example, geopolitical situations whereby international schools in those locations, they find in the main, I think it's about 75%, they can't talk about that local geopolitical situation. If you extrapolate that into talking about issues of diversity, you may find again that the local government may not enable them to talk about certain aspects of diversity. So school heads need to be very aware of those kind of things because you don't want people getting into trouble. But at the same time, if you can, behind the scenes, at least in some way, keep those conversations going, enable staff again to attend professional development so they can be building their ideas for such times as they are ready to be able to talk about diversity more openly. And then that could be very useful to them in the long run. But just generally to have good policies in a school whereby people can be free to be who they are, and as far as they're able to as well. And I'm talking here not only about learners, but also about teachers. So I mentioned earlier on here that people throughout their lives may struggle in various ways. For example, dyslexia is not just until you're 18. Dyslexia is until you die, basically. Same as if you're autistic or anything else. So there must be many, many teachers who have various conditions that they've learned to manage. Perhaps by using the organized binder, who knows? They may have worked out ways to circumvent certain things or ways to address certain situations where they struggle. So school leaders need to be aware they have a neurodiverse workforce as well, and to support their teachers as much as to support their learners.
Okay, Mitch, I give you one sentence wrap up for leaders. In one sentence, what would you tell international leaders that are wanting to incorporate more equitable practices in their schools?
One sentence.
Maybe two.
I will echo what Paul said. Of course, the opportunity for professional learning, professional development, and when the beautiful thing about executive functioning skills and developing, as Paul's saying, self-regulation and sense of self-accountability and that agency, like I can jump into what this is, this learning experience. The beautiful thing for the teacher is teachers don't have enough time in the first place to get through what they're tasked with teaching or want to teach. And that's a universal truth. You're never going to find a classroom teacher with extra time on their hands. It just is not the reality. And so even if I wanted to fit this in, where am I going to? But the beautiful thing about a lot of these factors is they're not taught in the traditional sense. They're best learned when students see them modeled, hence that binder or portfolio, and they get practice with them day after day after day within the context of what they're learning. So professional learning experience is about how to bring this work into your own practice. I would absolutely echo what Paul's saying, because then that makes for really interesting and engaging collaborative conversations at a school level, or a network or district level, or even a larger international level, like this community. So.
Well, I want to thank you both so much. I know we just barely dipped our toes in this ocean, and I did promise you we will consider having a longer conversation about this and have also a greater panel. I take away one of the first phrases that Paul started with, that there's neurodiversity in this world because we need diversity in the world, and I think that's a starting point that we can implement everywhere and anywhere, at any time, at any level, if we only understand that that's what we need. So I have thoroughly enjoyed listening to both of you, and I do hope that we keep this conversation going. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Paul. It is what a fantastic session to round it all up. And wow, there is a lot. I don't know about you, but that is so much to take in. And I need to go home tonight here in Cape Town and do some thinking, because wow, what a fantastic learning experience. Folks, as we wrap up this afternoon, our time here, I would love you to just head over to the poll that's going to be launched now. And on that poll, it's a very quick, literally less than a minute opportunity for you to let us know about your experience. This is really important for us so we can improve future events. So please feel free to share honestly about your enjoyment, what you loved, how we can grow. And please share that with you. I would also like to turn your attention to on Friday morning, you'll receive a post-event pack. It'll include many of the resources mentioned. It'll include a short summary of what was shared during the presentation. So that will all be brought together for you. We also have another live event tomorrow. So if any of your colleagues are in different time zones, remind them to register for tomorrow's event. And then we've got to say, are you ready for number 3? And that's going to be the next one coming up. We're looking at the need, and we're going to be launching the title and the topic of that very soon. So folks, a big thank you from all of us here in Cape Town and Kelly Education. A massive thank you on behalf of ICP and all the incredible speakers we have today. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.